And a very good evening to you. Welcome to Politics 101, our Tuesday night edition. I want to thank all of you for joining us. If you're joining from Guyana, wherever you are in Guyana, welcome to Politics 101. I want to thank you all for being faithful viewers of our program. We try we try to do what we set out to do, and that is to lift our conversation, lift our national debate, and contribute towards getting you behind the news, below the surface, as they would say. And I want to thank you all for believing in that mission. As I've said on this program over and over again, I respect the right of each presenter to decide what angle he or she would take whenever they are doing these new media programs, and that at the end of the day, one has to do what one is comfortable with doing. And I am comfortable with the angle that I bring to this mission. And I see it as a mission to take our country beyond the confines, the narrow confines of party politics and tribal politics, and to move us in a direction where we can appreciate even those with whom we disagree. And I start here tonight because last night, as you know, we did a program on Fobbs Burnham. He would have been 100 years old yesterday. And I had a panel last night, many of you were on, but some people were critical of me for doing a program on Burnham. They argued that given my own history of opposition to Burnham, that I had no business hosting a program on Burnham, that he was a dictator and all the things that people have said about him. And my response at the end of the program last night was very simple, that yes, I oppose Burnham. And if I were to be presented with similar circumstances by any government, I would respond the same way. But I also recognize that time moves on and one gets further and further away from particular moments. And one brings with that distance perspectives that one could not see in the heat of the moment. It was the 70s and the 80s, and our societies in the Caribbean were sharply divided between those who held the power, the custodians of post-colonial power, who felt that that power ought to be dispensed with in a certain way. They felt that that power had to be constructed in a certain way. They felt that that power ought to be used in a certain way. And then there were those of us who felt the power had to be used differently. The general disagreement we had in those early years of independence was what to do with independence and what was the meaning and tenor of independence. Did independence mean just reforms of the colonial order? Did it mean building bridges and roads? Did it mean bringing all of the opinions in the society together for the national good? Or did it mean transforming the society away from colonial rule? That there would be no half measures, that independence meant freedom. And there was that concourse of ideas, the clash of ideas. Professor Gordon Roller called it the clash between the fathers and mothers of independence and their sons and daughters. And unfortunately, it clashed. That disagreement over what our independence should mean took on proportions that brought to the fore an ugly side of our Guyanese and Caribbean being. Passions flared, and there was no in between. That was the nature of the conflict in those early years of independence. But as we move further and further away from the independence moment, both the radicals on our side and the reformists on the Burnham side, and the Eric Williams side, and the Errol Barrow side, I think both sides realized that we were both correct and we were both wrong. We could not know that at that particular moment. Mr. Burnham died in 1985 before a reconciliation between the radicals and the reformists, the fathers and the sons, the mothers and the daughters. I was fortunate to have had a few conversations with Desmond Hoyt, who took over from Burnham. And he came to Washington, D.C., and I was doing a television program at that time. And I interviewed him 3 times. And after the interview, he was gracious enough to have conversations with me about that period. I've never revealed this to anyone. But my conclusion about all of us being wrong and all of us being right was one that was echoed by Hoyt himself. I've learned that you don't say what somebody say when they're dead and they can't verify it. The point I'm making is that if you look across our Caribbean, you look at Trinidad, Eric Williams radicalized the whole Black Power generation, but they moved against him in 1970, in the 1970 revolution in Trinidad, and almost overthrew him. He was to put them on trial, and they got off, and they continued to function in the society. Williams radicalized that generation. And today, when we look at Trinidad, we see those who challenged Williams in 1970 are today recognizing Williams' role in post-colonial Guyana. The same can be said about those who challenged Michael Manley, or who challenged Eric Gary and actually overthrew him in Grenada. And so as we move along the independence project, we are recognizing that there could have been common ground and there should be common ground. Tim Hector went into one of the traditional parties, took his ACLM into one of the traditional parties in Antigua. Members of the revolutionary government are now in traditional parties in Grenada. Dr. Trevor Monroe, who was the leader of the Workers' Party of Jamaica, Communist Party of Jamaica, is now a member of the PNP, Manley's party. I am giving those examples to say that in small post-colonial societies like ours, we don't have the luxury of permanent disunity. We cannot build a nation. We cannot get to that promised land with permanent disunity. Some of the things we fought against Burnham for, we are still fighting against the government today for. And so it is not simply about Burnham. I think it's simply about us as a nation. Burnham was a product of our Guyana, our Caribbean. Eric Gary was a product of our Caribbean. Eric Williams was. Cheddy Jagan was a product of our Caribbean. The point I am making is that these men who we chastise, in many cases, quite rightly so, because they did engage in excesses, but they come from us and they present to us the complexity of our Guyana, our Caribbean. How can a man with such a progressive foreign policy, non-alignment, Burnham was a champion, Caribbean integration, he took the lead when others in Guyana faltered, anti-apartheid, African liberation, he took the lead, a most progressive foreign policy, but yet he could not reconcile himself with disagreement internally. He could not reconcile himself with dissent internally. The complexity, brilliant progressive foreign policy, but not being able to deal with dissent. It was the same with Kaunda. It was the same with Nkrumah. It was the same with Nyerere, different degrees. But here were brilliant post-colonial leaders grappling with the complexity of turning turning plantations into nations, stumbling as they went along. Should we throw out the babies with the bathwater? Was Burnham truly a good for nothing? Was Burnham truly a racist? Yes, Burnham committed his errors, some would say his political sins. But is he the devil incarnate that some of our friends make him out to be? If he is, then we are, because he comes from us. And so, the arc of history teaches me that one must appreciate the complexity of our being, the diversity of our being, what Professor Rex Netterford called order in chaos and chaos in order. If we don't understand that dialectic, we don't understand our Caribbean being. And so, I don't want to spend the rest of my political life cursing leaders. There was a time and place for that. I did more than curse. And now, It is time to consolidate. And if you curse Burnham and believe he's the devil incarnate, then you are going to believe that his party represents the devil incarnate, and that his disciples are the devil incarnate, and you are not going to be able to deal with them. You're going to treat them as the other, as not Guyanese. And therein lies the problem. Therein lies the problem. We have to come to grips with the complexities of our history. And we have to start by relocating the Burnhams and the Jagans, and the Williams and the Barrows and Garys and the Birds, relocating them in our wider consciousness of ourselves. And so therefore, whatever my experiences were in the 70s as a young man, a young man who thought that there was no middle ground, because that was the nature of our politics. And today, 40 years later, 50 years later, I recognize that there has to be a meeting place of the Burnhamites and the Jaganites, the Quayanites and the Rodneyites, all of us, Guyanese. There has to be a meeting place for all of us. And it is in that spirit that I hosted the program on Burnham and will host programs on Burnham again. It is not about us and them anymore. We had our time with us and them. I think that rather than chastising me for hosting a program on Burnham, one should say, if a David Hines give me his own history in fighting Burnham and Burnhamism, if a David Hines can be comfortable in observing the 100th birth anniversary of Burnham and to say kind things about Burnham, then it means that our politics are maturing. That is what I think we should be saying. To see it not as Rodney turning in his grave and all that nonsense. What do you know of Rodney that only Rodney knows? One thing I know of Rodney, and I know Rodney, I know him. Rodney was a concretist. When he was in Africa, he dealt with the realities of Africa. When he was in Jamaica, he dealt with the realities of Jamaica. And when he was in Guyana, he dealt with the realities of Guyana. One lesson I have learned from Walter Rodney and the UC Guyana is never to become prisoner, never to become a prisoner of ideology or praxis, that we must always seek to transcend the ideology to which we subscribe. And so, happy birthday to Forbes Burnham. I wish he had lived long enough, longer, so that the détente, the reconciliation at the political level that was made between the WPA and the PNC, that it could have had his blessings. Because that reconciliation meant that we had come full circle. And I hope that the Jaganites and the Burnhamites, and those of us who call ourselves Rodneyites and Quayanites, can one day sit at the same table and govern our country in the interest of Guyana. We have fought our fights. Some of the fights got bitter. But if 50 years after republicanism, we are still fighting the same fights we fought 50 years ago, we are still throwing dead dogs over the fences at each other, we are still allowing zombies to govern our political vision, then we have not matured. And I would like to think that I have matured politically. The Politics 101, my little sermon before we go on, and I hope that somebody in this audience listening to me can make sense of what I say and can put it into practice. We must get beyond the borders of political parties. We can admire our leaders. I do not expect Aubrey Norton and Vincent Alexander not to show their admiration of Burnham and to talk about the great things that he did. And I hope they don't expect me not to say the same thing about Quyana or Rodney. But I hope we all can recognize that there were shortcomings on all sides, but they were flashes of hope emanating from all sides. And my generation and the generations after me have to build. We fought in the 70s bitterly against each other so that today we don't have to fight against each other. Let's put it that way. Let's put it that way. And it's for that reason when the APNU was born out of an alliance between the PNC and the W, it was a joyful moment for people like me, because it meant that we were setting an example for generations to come, that it was possible for fierce opponents to find common ground. Ultimately, politics is not about how well you get along with friends, but how well you're able to work with those with whom you don't have a natural agreement. Clive Thomas made that quotation when they were launching the Third Force back in 2006, and I subscribe to that. Welcome to Politics 101. What a wonderful evening it is. A week that is pregnant with history, pregnant with the history of the 1763 revolution, Republican status, pregnant with Black history. And whether that Black is phenotypical Black, ideological Black, Blackness is broad, and that is why we talk about collective Blackness. That it just doesn't only include those of us who are phenotypically and culturally Black, but it also includes those who are politically Black. Walter Rodney, when Fidel Castro, sent troops all around the world to fight on the side of the anti-apartheid fighters who were fighting against the might of the apartheid army. And Castro sent troops to join them. Walter Rodney said that Castro was the blackest man alive. Not phenotypically Black, but politically black, ideologically black. And so people sometimes want to pin you into narrow confines. I refuse to be in there. At this point in history, I find myself witnessing for Black people more than I do for other groups. But if tomorrow Black people behave badly, I will say to them, you are wrong, as I have done before. You are wrong. And so I'm not in the business of socializing Black people to do wrong. You cannot resist and fight against wrong. That's 101. My guest tonight is the one and only GHK Lall, who's here tonight to share with us his wisdom, his perspective on some of the issues we confront today. Brother Gabriel, good evening.
Good evening to you. Good evening to all joining with us on this program. It's my privilege to be here to share.
And thank you so much for joining us. And of course, this is the week of Republican status, 53 years since we attained Republican status. Some people think that Republicanism means little. It has had no impact on the way we see ourselves as a nation, that it was a political ploy by the leaders at the time to gain total control of the society. And so therefore there is nothing to celebrate. Do you share that view?
No, I don't. It really, for me, was that last necessary step to remove the linkages to our past. And I noticed in your introduction, you spoke a lot about the past and our holding on to it. I felt it was a necessary step in 1970 for that to happen. But what I'm concerned about is that despite our Republican status, and on Republic Day, I've already have some writing circulating in a couple of media channels to share my perspectives and to give you and the audience a little preview. Have we grown, or have we replaced the linkages? Notice I say the linkages, the bondages of before, with a new bondage, a bondage that is inextricably linked, attached to our natural resource gifts. And so Republican status, republicanism, the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, was a vital necessity then, and it didn't come a moment too soon. But I'm asking myself, what have we done with all that self-empowerment and self-determination and self-rule in our hands? And I regret to say that we could have done more. We could always do more, but we could have done much more in contextually speaking. I welcome Republican status, especially now that I've grown more into what democracy is all about. Who says it? Who say they are about it? Who say that we manifest its best ideals? Only to be, and you are over in Arizona, David. I'm here. I was there in New York and Boston and elsewhere. And we saw things in a different light. Now, on the receiving end in Guyana, and you are dealing with democracy in a different, on the receiving end, and capitalist ideology in its worst manifestations. And I say that let us not sacrifice what it means to be a republic and to be living in a state of republicanism. Let us really It is imperative that we grasp at what this means, our leaders, our citizens, in terms of the rights and the powers that it gives us, and to not only grasp them, but to utilize them to the maximum for the benefit of every single Guyanese. Until we can get that instilled in our heads through our conversations, through our connections, through our relations, we will be stuck where we are, fighting and backbiting and backstabbing and dragging each other down into the crab barrel. In short, I welcome Republican status. I think it's a good thing. I think it puts everything in our hands. We control our destiny. We need to manage it better.
We need to manage it better. And that, for me, is the most important task of our independence management. From Burnham in the 60s to Ali now today in 2023, that remains the overriding question. The management of power, the management of power. And those who were critical of the early leaders, the Burnhams and the Eric Williams and so on, for what we saw as the mismanagement of power. That today we are still having to fight this mismanagement of power. I think it is more a question of self-examination rather than looking for devils as if we are a people without sin. And so, therefore, there are few sinners who we can cast aside, and the rest of us would be pure. I know you're the first man. I would like you to comment on that.
Well, we are too much living in the past. We are imprisoned by the past. Like you, I had my misgivings about Mr. Burnham and Eric Williams and Manley and Barrow, and how they use the power in their hands. And they were the first practitioners of it in the post-colonial era. And but the conversation must not be stuck there. This must not be the limit, the extent, my brother and our fellow Guyanese listening here. This must not be the limit of our intellect. This must not be the expanse of our sagacity, that we are always looking back instead of looking ahead, looking at what we have in our hands now, what we've been blessed with, and and putting ourselves in that position where we can extricate the maximum benefit out of it. And we don't even have to get the maximum for all of us to have a fair share. And I'm talking about a number of things here. So we have to move away from cursing at leaders. Some people don't like Burnham, the name. I think he was a good man. He has his major faults. I think he even qualifies to be a great Guyanese, without a doubt. Perspective, retrospective, this is not revisionist history. Yes, he did some terrible wrongs. Cheddy Jagan is not as heroic as he's made out to be. But he was also a good and a great Guyanese, make no mistake about that. And we should not, regardless of our side of the political persuasion, of the political following, we must not demonize these men perpetually. Because when we continue to do so, then we're demonizing ourselves, aren't we? We're demonizing ourselves because we are sons of this country. And if we, in our collective wisdom, could not summon the will, the strength, and the purpose to say, well, I want to be, you said common ground, I want to say a higher ground. And we keep reaching ever higher and higher. We are not getting out of the gutter. When we look back and we castigate a Forbes Burnham or a Chetty Jagan, a Walter Rodney or a UC Guayana. What when we are locked into that parochialism, that provincialism, I'm sorry for these words, when we are locked in that narrow frame of mind, then how do we justify all these great gifts that we've had over the decades? How do we uh, how do we feel about ourselves? I frankly don't feel very good about where we are. We have not traveled. 53 years later, 53 years later, almost as long as I've been on this earth, we are in the same place. We're talking about race in terms of the slurs for the two major races and the original people. Is that what we are made of? What is it? Where is our progress? What can we say about ourselves that recommend us to a different place in that we have earned it? We have grown into it. We, we, the most watched people on earth today, I would think, from what I'm reading and hearing, the most envied people, given what has come into our hands. And yet we are at each other's throats. We are ready to gouge the eyes of each other and tear our livers out because we are still trapped in the past. We are we are consumed by precedent. We are impassioned by the prisons we erect for ourselves. We've got to move on. We've got to move away. We've got to move up. We've got to move up, out and away and up from where we are, where we were 53 years ago, where we were in the 90s, where we are in this 21st century. We're not helping ourselves. We are not helping ourselves. And we need, I need to move from this negative tone. There's so much we can do. There is so much we can do. But if we are waiting in ambush, if we are waiting in ambush to just lash out at each other, to lean into each other, and to bash each other, and to make losers of each other. Ultimately, that's what we are going to end up doing, because we are not thinking of doing anything else.
GHK Lall, reflecting on our journey from Republican status in 1970, when we led the rest of the Caribbean in making that final step away from a sordid monarchy and proclaiming our independence, but reflecting on that journey. Have we done ourselves justice in that journey? As GHK said, the verdict is still out. GHK, you've been grappling since the last budget. You've been grappling with the question of development and the plenty, the relative plenty that has come our way, and what is being done with it, and what could be done with it. And of course, like everything that has to do with these post-plantation outposts, it's not an easy road. It's not an easy slam dunk answer. We are discovering our complexities every day, our complexities as a nation. The way in which sometimes we have tried to make our nation simpler when it is not that simple. In our quest sometimes for the rhetoric of nationalism, we sometimes paper over our differences. And in the age of oil, in the age of plenty, when economists says that when you have plenty, then your differences and your conflict would decrease. But we are seeing in our age of plenty the opposite, and you've been grappling with that. How are we, GHK, How are we going to make this wealth make us a better nation?
I want to go back in history a bit, and
Please do.
it continues to the segment from a moment ago. Let's look at the Romans. The Romans overwhelmed all the military powers of its time crushingly. It beat the hell out of them. It beat them up badly. The Romans were the rulers of the world 2,000 years ago. And what brought the Romans down? Partisanship in the domestic realm. Outsiders didn't bring them down. You had Julius Caesar on the one hand and Cato on the other, and they both had visions of where the Roman Republic should go. And the twain could not meet. And so people took sides, Romans took sides, and the Roman Empire eventually had that long, agonizing collapse. It was internally driven by partisan warfare. We have, before oil, we've had our partisanship, but I've never seen it so raw and so crude and so poignant, so pungent also, since the discovery of oil 7 years ago. I've never seen it this way. It's like the worst in us has been brought out. We have budgets. The last one, 22, a record one, and 23, a record that is bigger than that one, the biggest ever. That's a good thing. We're taking money out of the oil fund. I'm not so sure that is a good thing and so much so quickly. We are borrowing more money, and yet we have so many people crying out in anguish. We have we have the World Bank reporting. We have the IDB speaking about who is hungry and who can't afford a proper meal. We have the World Bank talking about 48% of Guyanese living on $5 and $5 US a day. And we know what our minimum wage is and what our public servants are taking home, are getting. And after all of the provisions, all of the provisions in this year's budget, we still have not enough done, far from enough done for our poor in this country, our impoverished, our minimum wage workers, the army of people, of citizens in this country who just can't make ends meet, for whom survival is a daily struggle. Pensioners got $5,000. What is that? 25 US dollars a month? They've gone from 28 to 33. If this is the best we can do in a $786 billion budget, then we're not taking care of our own. The tax threshold went up by another $10,000. So in essence, you've got another $3,000, give or take, in your paycheck per month. Yes, and it has more people there. And so those above that limit are going to get a little something more in their pockets. Okay, because we care, has some more money going directly to people. These things help. Let us not dismiss what the government has done. But on a scale of 1 to 100, we're talking about we are talking about a starting point and a finishing point of about 15%. In other words, the government had to do multiples of what it has done in the budget for relief provisions, direct relief provisions, notwithstanding fuel subsidy, electricity subsidy, and water subsidy. I'm saying, inclusive of all of that, when people go to the marketplace, they do not have the funds in their hands to buy not grapes, not Brussels sprouts, not broccoli, but to buy bora and balanji and sweet potato, things that are grown in this country. We hear, I read, and I comment almost weekly, at least for the past several weeks, in Starbuck News on its series called "The Impact of the High Cost of Living," and it's been dreadful. It's been dreadful, and today, I think it's today or yesterday, what I wrote is that we have all these people crying out and suffering. We have Starbuck News reporting, and what we have is our leaders averting their gaze. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to see it. They don't want to know about it, or they pretend not to know about it. But how can they not know about what is going on when we have all this money being spent on the opposite direction on infrastructure? A good thing. Roads and bridges and wells and ports and what have you are all good things. But understand this, the skew is too much. The skew is too much. When we have such a minuscule percentage of our budget earmarked, identified, and set aside for assisting those who are most in need, and so much more for the non human segments, the building up for tomorrow. Yes, yes, yes. I applaud the government for that. But I have to haul it over the coals and say, why in this time of oil, when you're taking money from the fund, when you have record budgets, when you're borrowing by the billions, why is it my president, my minister of finance, the budget team? Well, I mean, they're secondary to the process. Why couldn't there be much more of a heart and much more of thinking in terms of what we can do for our people first? That we have to balance the development priorities, which is an umbrella. The national development priorities, as stated by the Honorable Minister of Finance a couple of years ago, national development priorities, that's oil money. I mean, national development priorities camouflages a lot of good things, but it also provides the umbrella for a lot of other things, things that fall under the categories of skullduggeries and shenanigans. And nobody in this country needs introduction to that where our politicians are concerned, regardless of whether it's the PPP or the PNC or whatever C it may be. Everybody wants their share and they usually take their share, regardless what is said. Now, we have to balance building versus building our people up. We are certainly building. We are certainly building, but we are not building our people to get off the ground, to get out of the poverty gutter.
We are not building our people. We are building, but we are not building our people to get out of the gutter. Quite profound. Good evening to those of you who have joined us in this evening's edition of Politics 101. GHK Lall is here, and you did ask about Dr. Jeffrey. Dr. Jeffrey has taken a little break. He's a former professor, and every now and again, we professors go on what we call sabbatical, right? So he has taken a little sabbatical. He will be back. He certainly will be back shortly. So he has not left the program. He's just taken a little sabbatical, and thanks for those of you who recognize when thing not regular, you do recognize that. Dr. Jeffrey is going to be back with GHK Lall in the customary position. GHK Lall is doubling for himself and Dr. Jeffrey. But Dr. Jeffrey will be back. Good evening to all of you. And Mashramani is coming in a couple of days. Happy Mashramani to you Guyanese. If you're in Trinidad, well, yesterday was Mass, and today, Tuesday. Do they have Carnival Tuesday? I think so. I know Carnival Monday, and there may be Carnival Tuesday. It was good to see young O'Connor, 20 years old, winning the Calypso Crown in Trinidad and Tobago. I mean, Sparrow won the crown in 1956. He was 21 years old at that time. And I think that remained the record until this young man, 20 years old, his father is Dwayne O'Connor. Dwayne O'Connor who won the crown, I think 6 years ago, 7 years ago, with his son, 20-year-old young man, winning the Calypso crown in Trinidad and Tobago, taking the record away from Slinger Francisco, the mighty Sparrow, who won in 1956 with Jean and Dinah, Rosita and Tina. He was 21 old. The mighty Sparrow is alive. He is, of course, going to be 88 years old this year, and he still makes some appearances, although he's not mobile as he used to be. But I'm trying to get some information on what's happening with our Mashramani competition in Guyana. I hope if there's somebody in the audience who's close to that arena, please get in touch with me because I would like to cover part of that Mashramani, especially the Calypso part of it, in the next week or so. GHK, Woodley Park. We read, we saw some images. And you know, the Americans like to say when these things happen, that is not who we are. This is not who we are. As if some of these nasty things are outside of us. Woodley Park, what are your reflections on what you saw there? Are you surprised that things are going in that direction? And is it too late to pull it back?
Well, I'm not surprised, given I am not on social media, but I'm aware of the vitriol that goes on there. And Woodley Park comes and stuns, but a Woodley Park should never be. Not when we are talking about one Guyana. Has that sunk into anybody? If it should sink in to any Guyanese, it should be those who are of the president's fold, supporting caste out in the far regions, Woodley Park being one of them. But to see that kind of vileness being so publicly manifested is shocking. It is shocking. And what I'm particularly concerned about is that there is no outcry, there is no denunciation in the mainstream media, at least the ones that I follow, which are Starbuck News and Kaieteur News and Demerara Waves. And it may have been elsewhere, and I apologize if I missed that. But there's no expression of consternation as to this should not be. It is not coming from the government side. Of course, it involves their people on the surface of it, people with wood, with racial slurs. How can that be condoned? How has that struck us dumb? How is it that we have nothing to say now? If the roles were reversed, oh my God, I can only begin to anticipate what would have been the reactions. There would have been no space for me in the papers to say a word or two about anything, the budget, about crime, about leadership or governance. Because the media, the mainstream independent media would have been saturated by expressions of outrage. Where is the outrage, the broad-based outrage on Woodley Park? Where is the Minister of Education has promised, has come right out, and we commend her for that, has come right out and said a full investigation will take place. And I commit to, I'm using my words here, and I commit to sharing the findings at the earliest opportunity. Good, sounds nice, but I think we've heard this before from different corners of the government. So I'm going to take that under advisement for the time being. What I'd like to put before our listeners, our viewership, is that I understand that there are circumstances, I'm going to choose my words very carefully here, that there are circumstances where African Guyanese, black Guyanese, in that Woodley Park area are not saying as much as they want to say, as much as they should say, because they are fearful of intimidation and victimization. And people, citizens of this country, can fear their government like that, their authorities like that, we are not in a good place. 53rd anniversary of Mashramani, our birthday, and all of that duly considered, we are in a troubled place, and this is putting it mildly. Are we too far gone? I am very unhappy about this, meaning that as these things multiply, Woodley Park today, and somewhere else the other day, and another place another time, whether it's Dartmouth or or Headley or the police or whatever. These things have a way of aggregating and coalescing, and then they explode. It's a word that we hesitate to use in these correct times, very sensitive times, but they explode because people, our world is interconnected these days. So nothing stays hidden. We don't have to wait for the postman to bring the mail or the newspaper carrier to bring the Guyana Graphic or the Guyana Chronicle or the Argosy from the 60s and 70s. We're talking here now, and people can listen to us from, I don't know, Europe and North America and the region and in the far reaches of Guyana. This can be recorded and seen again and again and again. And I'm sure that is what is happening. And so we send a WhatsApp or a screenshot, whether it's of Woodley Park or where, and it circulates. It gains traction. It incites passions. That could be me. That could be me as a non-black man for speaking out about issues in this country that infect and impair others in this country, particularly African Guyanese. So who am I to say that? How dare I say that? But I'm saying, in all honesty, where are the others who need to say something about Woodley Park and say, and I am particularly concerned that people are so fearful, apprehensive, that's a milder word, are so apprehensive that they prefer to let this thing die away. Let this thing go along its way. And so we could at least live in some sense of peace for the time being, for now. So that's what I'm hearing here. But that is the underbelly of Woodley Park. Very clear, very blatant, very racist, very open, public, and we are having this conversation. Where are the other conversations? Where are the other necessary conversations when things happen like this? Only, or to go back to what you said, only one side got demons, the other have only angels. Well, you tell me, my brother, where are the angels there among those brothers of ours in Woodley Park?
And GHK and Dr. Jeffrey, I remember, and the audience remember very well. I asking them, where is this going to lead? And both men said months ago, it's not going to get better. But you still, I'm sure GHK, Henry, myself, we still hope it would get better. One of my favorite calypsos is one song by David Rudder at the end of the Cold War called 1990, sung in the 1990s. And his central argument in that calypso was he doesn't believe that the end of the Cold War would change anything for third world countries and for black people and brown people. But he asks in the song, 1990, please make a liar of me. 1990, please make a believer of me. And I am sure, GHK, that although we know that the trajectory on which this country is on will take us to Woodley Park, we are still hoping that they make a liar of us. And so you wake up, as Martin Carter would say, and you search for birds and sunlight. And then instead of birds and sunlight, you get Woodley Park. And you wonder about our country. And as you quite rightly said, those with the largest bullhorns are saying nothing. It's as if it never happens. And this is what I think will breed more and more of Woodley Park. Is there going to be a reaction from the other side? After all, in the week Woodley Park is happening, people from Golden Grove are being charged with terrorism. And what we see in Woodley Park may be similar to what we saw at Monrepo. But at Monrepo, they were compensated and people are charged for terror. At Woodley Park, they're promised an investigation. How can we not see the apartheid philosophy in action? It's not about living separately. It's about separate treatment, separate justice, separate meanings. GHK Lall, please make a liar of me.
Well, if we give up hope, then we have nothing. If we give up hope and descend into a state of hopelessness, Woodley Park, one or more, and you hope that there is never any more, then we have nothing. When we live in hopelessness, that's a terrible evil. And I think I may have said that here before. Now, those with the biggest bullhorns suddenly have no horns. Everybody who had horns on their heads, the devil incarnate, when that is on the other foot, we're not hearing about that. Yes, we do have a system. We have two systems of justice, two countries, two reactions, two treatments, two resolutions, two and two and two, on and on and on. Yes, we charge people for terrorism. How does that equate to what it's doing? When the police set up roadblocks or an intervention point beyond the Monrepo market and were slow to act. How do we charge people with terrorism? And certainly what was done is not being condoned here. I don't think by you or by me, never will be. We must call out our own when wrongs happen. But how do we charge them with terrorism when we have a leading political figure in this country says to us, if you want, you've got to come to me and deal with me in my place, on my terms, in my time, in my way. Isn't that taking the patrimony of the people, budgeted or otherwise, slush funds or otherwise, and inflicting terror upon them to subjugate them to your will? Isn't that a form of intimidation? Isn't that a form of menace? Isn't that a form of leadership terror? You come to me and you deal with me, and I will deal with you when I'm ready for you. You don't do that to your friends. You do that to not even adversaries. You deal with that, you deal like that with enemies. And you are talking to me about one Guyana. One Guyana in that way, with that standard of that level of charges meted out, then all of us are terrorists. We are terrorists. We are media terrorists. We are print media terrorists. We are whatever this is called, electronic media terrorists, because we are saying that which is not found satisfying or acceptable. Because unless you toe the line and follow the line, then you are an enemy. You are being made. You are made into one. Right? This has all the hallmarks of the totalitarianism of China and North Korea and the old Russia, and maybe even today now. Unless, and Dr. Jeffrey likes to say this, there is total control and total domination, then there is no satisfaction in the ranks of the ruling PPP government. Now, you you have this imbalance, and imbalance is a charitable word. You have this double standard. You have this double dealing. You deal one way with your people, you cover up and you delay and you stonewall, and you have that masquerade of between the police and the OPR and the DPP's office, and back and forth, and the investigations are continuing, and the police are investigating. And in this instance here, you slap them, you go after them with that kind of energy, commendable energy, and then you, lo and behold, terrorists terrorists. And everybody applauds. Everybody applauds, right? So I mean, have we sunk so low? Again, I go back 53 years later. Where have we progressed? Where have we progressed from the heaving, roiling 1970s, from February 23rd, 1970 to today? Today we're in a better place. Today we have more money. Today we have more wisdom. Today we're supposed to have the invaluable, the priceless treasure of experience, having walked that road, having lived in that darkness, that we now can say, well, we don't want to go back there and we don't want to deal with that anymore. We want to deal with each other in an honest, principled, and an orderly way that is about fairness and justice and equity and all those things that we love to talk so much about. Let us live them. Let us make a start living them, and then we can perhaps get some traction, leading to some momentum.
As Ian says here, amen and amen. Preach it, Mr. Lall. God bless Mr. Lall. I love this thing on the screen in which this person is asking who in Woodley Park got robbed and their property destroyed. This person doesn't see attempt on people's lives.
Well, you've got people, with adults with wood, more than once, promising to come back and come back. And you're talking about a child. Again, I say, in response to anybody, reverse the roles, reverse the colors, reverse the victims, and that question, I am convinced, will never be tabled. Will never be tabled. But what's going to be tabled is, you see how they're warish. You see how they're low, that even the pick me them, they got for butter. But now we be hearing about who get robbed and who property and whatever. Okay? I would like to see some compassion extended, not by the headmistress, by the Minister of Education or some high-ranking team from the Ministry of Education. Say, we are concerned about what is happening here, what happened here, so that is why we are here. I'm yet to wait, but
GHK
we are
Lall,
waiting on an investigation.
GHK Lall, they're speaking on that atrocity that occurred in Woodley Park. And even for those of us who've lived long enough and we think we've seen it all, we are shocked. We are shocked. And it's not a one-time thing. You go right back in this season, right back to Orrin Boston, come right through Peter Headley, Quindon Bacchus. In election month, election week in 2020, school children were stoned. Police women were beaten, police were chased. Was anybody charged with terrorism? Roads were burnt. Vehicles were damaged. Was anyone charged with terrorism? This is not an equal place, and this is not a place of equality before the law, as Brother Coffey has said. It's a fundamental right. Fundamental right. Many of them said, David, why you always concentrating on race? My goodness, how can I look at what happened at Woodley Park? And I know what happened at other places when there were protests by other groups. How can I look at men being charged for terrorism? Terrorism is a stigma in today's world. A stigma. A terrorist is a stigma for life. How can I look at those things and come on this program and talk about neoliberalism?
How can we look at
GHK,
how can we look at what happened in Bath Settlement, where a policewoman, as you rightly said, was injured, and her and a police officer was almost killed. Was almost killed a couple of years ago, and the police ranks were run out of that area in Bath. What happened then? What about the energy and the anger of the Ghana police force then? What about a terrorism charge for those who were responsible then? But we have that now. So, I mean, we can continue like this, but I think it has to stop when we say to each other very quietly, well, what happened then and what is happening here? And how do you tell me that we can ever make a move to one of something for this country when we have this kind of disparity, glaring disparity that instills in us that things are not as they are said or as they should be?
GHK, is there anything that you wanted to say that I've not asked? Now is your chance.
I'm sorry I missed the last piece.
No, I'm saying, is there anything that you wanted to comment on that I've not? Please do so.
Oh, no, there were some other, I know it's late in the day here, but there were some other areas that we wanted to talk about. Do we have time to talk about them, or should I just?
Yes, go right ahead. No, go right ahead. You can choose one of them.
Yeah. Yes, well, I wanted to talk, and I think I'll be able to cover them in the next several minutes very, very rapidly. We've had protests. We've had protests in Sri Lanka almost a year ago that were mass protests, and incidentally, a Roman Catholic archbishop was very, very prominent in backing those protests, and we know what happened there. And we'll come back to why that happened there. And then there are protests in Great Britain: bus drivers, train drivers, nurses, ambulance drivers, among others. Hasn't happened in years. There is a connecting thread there. And then we had protests last week in Suriname. Parliament was stormed, and regrettably, most regrettably, the protests descended into looting of businesses. When that occurs, it takes away from the validity of legitimate protests and protesters. Let's not make any, when we fall right into the traps, whoever we are, Surinamese or Sri Lankans or whomever. The English are showing us how to do this. The English and I think the Scots and the whomever else in Great Britain. Now, there is a common thread that connects those protests. Last week, that started in Britain before, in Suriname, that started in Britain before, and from last year in Sri Lanka, in a word, a hyphenated word: cost of living. Cost of living in Sri Lanka, fuels and fertilizers and pressures in Great Britain, soaring inflation, which means cost of living. In Suriname, the same thing. People are fighting for survival. Suriname has oil. Sri Lanka has a lot of debt, political mismanagement. Great Britain is struggling to get its grip on its political governance system. But the bottom line here is that political cost of living is for compelling citizens in those three countries to go out into the streets in numbers. In Guyana, we talked about it last year before the budget. We've been talking about it and writing about it since the budget, about the cost of living. The government says we are fearful of inflation, accelerated inflation. I am saying you can talk all we want about inflation, but we also have to consider starvation. And that's what is happening there, right? Cost of living sooner or later is going to leave Guyanese so empty-handed, so empty-stomached, that they're going to have no choice but to say relief, or we are going to resist. That's one. The next thing I understand that I think we wanted to talk about was that the commissioner of police, the acting commissioner, and we spoke about this before, where the Honorable Minister of Home Affairs, Mr. Ben, expressed tremendous confidence in the acting commissioner Hicken. Now, I noticed that the opposition leader, Mr. Norton, has come out and say, well, we aren't so sure about that. As a matter of fact, we are adamant that we are going to be against that, any such move. So I'm waiting to see how the president is going to react in terms of his consultations and his maneuvers. Here is where I'm going with this. With due respect to Acting Commissioner Hicken, he is a divisive figure. To proceed with a mantra of one Guyana and Mr. Hicken, regardless of the endorsements of the Minister of Home Affairs, in the context of one Guyana and within the milieu of Guyanese, a tremendous amount of Guyanese resentments and abhorrence over the thought of him being confirmed as commissioner, will challenge the president to see what he's really made of, or how really authentic he is about one Guyana. Because if you were to go there, then you're really contributing to the further dividing of this country. The fact that you have somebody who I understand has a PhD and is considered and is more senior, you have him sitting in some corner office, one of those sinecure jobs doing nothing, that really tells me that the fix is in, and this thing is going down the road for the next couple of years until Mr. Williams' retirement age. is reached and he is sent off. So that's where I am. And that's the things that I wanted to touch upon very briefly in the interest of time.
GHK Lall here this evening, helping us to get beneath the surface and to take a critical look at some of these developments in our country. My brother, thank you very much for availing yourself and to come on and to do what you described before we came on air as God's work. And that is to recognize that God is not a God that takes an arm's length attitude to suffering.
And he
And
doesn't
that,
take sides.
and he
And he
doesn't
doesn't take
take
sides.
sides. And he
And,
doesn't
uh,
take
and
sides.
he has no favorites. At
And,
least,
and no favor.
and I believe that. And I believe that. And I want to say to my fellow Guyanese and to all our listeners that, let's make the best of our matrimony. And let us remember as we share, as we articulate in the public space, and even in the private spaces, that what we are doing when we table these burning issues, these supposedly disputed issues that nobody want to hear about, we're not fanning any flames. I am not. What we are doing is alerting as to where things could deteriorate if they are not addressed. We're alerting, not fanning anything. With that, I say good night and happy birthday, all Guyana.
And thank you very much, GHK Lal, for coming on and giving us more than a mouthful tonight. You know, we are so we are so fortunate to have brothers like Brother Gabriel GHK Lal, who is prepared to swim against the tide if that tide is the kind of tide that takes us away from our independence mission. We thank God, and we thank the ancestors for sending such people our way. Tomorrow night, I'm going to cover the Woodley Park incident in its entirety. We're going to have the parliamentarian from West Bobis, Vince Roy Jordan. We're going to have Lincoln Lewis. And I'm trying hard to see if I get Carol Joseph, that woman who they've been demonizing in West Bobis there. So we're going to have a West Bobis panel tomorrow night to dig deeper into that abomination that took place at Woodley Park. Until tomorrow night, I want you all to stay safe. If you're mashing in Guyana, take one for me. Shake a leg, take a little drink for me. And I understand, I think Ian informed us that young Bill Rogers won the Mashramani Calypso Monarchy in Guyana. I didn't see much of it in the newspaper, God Lord. But I will try to get in touch with young Bill Rogers and try to get him onto Politics 101. If anybody in the audience knows him, please tell him to make contact with Dr. Hines, that I'm looking for him. I want him on Politics 101 so that we can deal with some culture. Young Bill Rogers, the son of the iconic Bill Rogers, the Bushman. And a man sing a song with 42,000 bush. I understand that that song was very popular even in New York back when he sang it eons and eons ago. Congratulations to young Bill Rogers. And if anybody in the audience knows him, tell him I'm looking for him. I will try to make contact with him to bring him on Politics 101 tomorrow night. Tomorrow night, we're digging deeper into Woodley Park. I'm going to have the West Bobby's team here tomorrow night. Tomorrow night. And I think on Thursday night we're going to be talking about Republicanism with an all-star team. And then, of course, on Friday night, it's Black Lives, well, Black Matters. Black Lives Matter. Black Matters. Good night, and see you all tomorrow night.